Okay, so welcome everyone. This is a very rare and special sort of interview setup, which we've never done before on Making a Club Champion. So Making a Club Champion was started about 3 years ago, and it's mainly around the actionable tools, philosophies, drills from some of the best golf coaches around the world. We've had the likes of Dave Orrid, who works with Francesco Molinari, Phil Kenyon, the putting coach to Stenson McElroy, Pia Nielsen, Vision of 54, and much, much more. So there's lots of actionable interviews on the website at makingaclubchampion.com. In this interview, we're doing actually a sort of three-way conversation with two very special guests. We've both had them on before. One of them is Sam Jarman, who was a very sort of up-and-coming great good golfer, and now has sort of turned his life to teaching and being an author of The Three Principles, which is one of the best-selling books on Amazon in the golfing category. And Malcolm Lewis, who was Silver Open medal winner. Was it 2 times, Malcolm, or was it just the one?
Just one.
Just the one.
Just
1982. 82. I think it was Tom Watson who was the winner. And so what I'll do is I'll introduce both of the guests, and they can just talk about themselves, and then we'll see what comes up in the topic of conversations. So Sam, welcome to the show. If you want to give us a little bit more of a deeper background on yourself, and then go across to Malcolm.
Hi guys, good afternoon. So Sam Jarman, I describe myself as a golf coach, but I wear a few different hats. I've written a couple of books, and I do some speaking. I do some work in schools as well. I played decent level golf for about 10 years as an amateur, and then on the mini tours. And looking forward to an interesting conversation.
Lovely.
And Malcolm?
Right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm a little bit older than these youngsters. I'm in my early 60s now, but played a lot of golf as a young amateur, playing internationally in the Open and Walker Cup in England, but ended up deciding not to go down tour golf route, and in fact ended up becoming a chartered accountant and qualified with KPMG. And then most of my life I have worked with main boards around the psychology and leadership of those boards, integrating hard issues, tangible, financial, strategic issues, all the way through to psychological and spiritual ones. And although I'm half retired, I've been doing a lot of work around consciousness, and it's been really exciting over this recent period to connect with Sam and to find out all the work that he's been doing in applying consciousness to golf. So I'm also likewise very excited about this afternoon.
Wonderful. So let's, if we picked up on sort of consciousness and golf. So Sam, you wrote the book, The Three Principles to Outstanding Golf. We have talked about this in a previous episode on Making a Club Champion, but I was wondering if we could just start there and how this sort of published work came to be.
Yeah, sure. So the book, I was never intending to write a book. It started off as an article. I went out to the US to work with my mentor, a guy called Garrett Kramer, who has worked with a number of PGA Tour players. He also works with ice hockey players, basketball players, baseball players. And I was just on the plane on the way home and started making a few notes and kept going, basically. And the book was basically a description of how I came to this understanding, and how I'd always struggled with my golf producing my best when I really wanted to. That was the fundamental thing. I knew I could play. You know, I'd had some decent results, but I struggled with a lot of anxious feelings, a lot of insecurity, and just the first big insight I had was this understanding that my feelings weren't coming from the game of golf or the people around me or the amount of money in my bank account or the numbers that I was writing down on my scorecard, which I'd always took to be the case. It really looked to me like how I was feeling was dependent on the situation or circumstances of my life, and that was the world that I was living in. And I kind of think that most people have that perception. And just for me, that was the first insight, seeing that wasn't true, that I could be standing over a 5-foot putt one day and I would be a bag of nerves, and then I'd be standing over a putt in a virtually identical situation a couple of days later and feel perfectly okay. So, just looking at it logically, there can't be a causal relationship between the situation and circumstance if one day we feel one way about it and another day we feel differently about it. So that was the first big sort of breakthrough for me, and the first book was basically my journey to get to that point, and then sort of the understanding, trying to put a scaffolding around that to help other golfers to see what I was pointing to and to help them see something similar in their own games. And then from there, my understanding sort of continued to deepen, and I started getting... It was more of a sort of philosophical journey, really. So starting to ask even deeper questions about where pressure comes from, and who is it that is actually feeling pressure. So the three big questions that I looked at and that I'm now exploring with other golfers are: who am I? What's the nature of reality? So what is this? What is this experience that we're having? And what is the meaning of life? What's the purpose? Why are we here? Because all of those questions are actually, we're asking those to ourselves, or human beings have been asking themselves those questions for about the past 3,000 years, probably longer. And whether we realize it or not, the way we live our everyday lives, so whether it's the way we play our golf, or the way that we go to work, or the way that we relate to other people, those questions are present all the time. Even if they're not on the surface, they're going on underneath. And a lot of the struggles and a lot of the striving that people do are down to the fact that they have got some misunderstandings around those questions, particularly the who am I question.
So it sounded like asking really just better questions on oneself sort of led you down this route. I'm just wondering how, what sort of is not surrendering, but how did you get to that moment of not, say, pushing against your ego, forcing yourself to try harder, to shoot lower scores, because that seems just the more obvious route. So I'm just wondering how you sort of got to that sort of life philosophy and got to that place.
So like I said, the first sort of revelation to me was this idea that my feelings weren't coming from the tournament. So, I could be feeling nervous, I'd be feeling insecure, whether it was at the start of a round or maybe, coming down the last few holes when I was in contention. And I could see that, I knew, both logically and on a deeper level, that my feelings weren't coming from the situation. But I still felt shit. I still felt nervous. I still felt anxious. I still felt insecure. So, I kind of knew that I'd got part of the picture, but I hadn't got all of the picture. And it wasn't till probably 4 or 5 years after my first insight, so this is probably now 4 or 5 years ago, that I saw that I'd made a categorical mistake about who it was that was having the experience of insecurity or anxiety or being in contention. Because when we say the phrase "I am nervous" or "I am anxious" or "I am frustrated," or even "I am a golfer" or "I am a father," "I am a mother," we look at the second part of that sentence as the important bit. What we do is, so if we say "I am frustrated," we go, okay, frustrated is the key part of the sentence. So what is it that's causing my frustration? That's where we go with it. That's where our attention goes. It goes outwards. And at some point, something just said, look, this isn't working because you're still feeling the feelings that you know, that of insecurity. And for some reason, I just flipped it round, and it was like, well, who or what's the start of that sentence? Who or what is this the I am part of that sentence that is experiencing these things? And when you start to explore that more deeply, what you see is that, you know, this idea that who we really are, our true nature, the real self, if you want to call it that, is something physical. It's a body. We believe it to be a body and a mind. That's what most people would perceive themselves to be most of the time. And you start to explore that, and you look for that entity, that person, that thing, and you see that it just doesn't exist. I have a body, but I'm not a body. I have a mind, but I don't refer to myself as I am my mind. My mind is known. My body is known. Well, what the hell is it that is knowing? What is the awareness of my body and my mind? Maybe that's what I'm referring to when I say the words I am, not the physical thing. And starting to go off down that path was immediately much, much more fruitful, because I just started to see that the anxiety that I was feeling, there was something there that knows that anxiety and that insecurity and that fear and that frustration. But it wasn't affected by it. It wasn't harmed by it. Its value wasn't diminished by whether I shot 68 or enhanced if I shot 68 or diminished if I shot 98. The awareness of my score was just the same. It didn't change. And that was huge, because all of a sudden it was like, oh, I've had this backwards the whole time, and I've just been reacting and feeling and coping and stressing on behalf of an entity that doesn't exist. And that was when the handbrake came off, basically.
And could you sort of identify those things as perhaps maybe like the ego or the stories we craft and curate for ourselves?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So your ego in this context, there's lots of, ego is just an old word for I, but you can take that in different ways. So the I that I was referring to in this is the character in the story of Sam. So this idea that there is a thing, and it was born, it grew up, it went to school, it did some sport, it got good at one sport, and then it tried to make a living at this sport. It wasn't good enough, so that made it miserable. All of these things were not that wasn't who I was. That was what happened to me or what I did. And seeing that separation was, like I say, it was just like the biggest release, because all of a sudden I saw that it wasn't essential. Before, I was living in this paradigm where it was vital that the central character in the story of my life, that story had a happy ending. And that's where the pressure comes from. It's not from how the story is working out. It's from the identification with the I thought, or the identification with a me that believes that in order for it to be okay, the story has to go a certain way. And the moment you let go of the I thought, the story just evaporates. It's like it just becomes, a story. It becomes a fiction rather than a fact, if that makes sense. And once that happens, it's kind of like as I say, that's the true definition of freedom. It's just a release from an identification with a fictional character. And what happens then is you can kind of choose whether you go along with the story or whether you let it go.
On that, you got So you could have like some really empowering stories that sort of craft this very empowering sort of story and narrative. If you're on the golf course or outside of the golf course, you can feed that. Such as this way as like sort of Stoics used to say, you are not the stories that you tell yourself. What were some of the sort of stories that you were telling yourselves, or identifications sort of growing up with the game of golf, that sort of created that gap between, you and this sort of story, and then that created the sort of, it could be the anxiousness or...
Yeah, so it's obviously when you first start playing, there's no story there. It's just something you do for fun, and that's how children play. They might have a story, but they're not attached to it in the same way that I was, because I very sort of, once I started seeing golf as potentially a way to make a career or earn my living, or I defined myself by how I played golf. Good golf made me a better person, and bad golf made me a much worse person. That was how it was. So there's all sorts of other things that go along with that. What other people think of me, who's defining success or failure. You're constantly judging yourself. You're constantly judging a situation as to whether it's good or bad or not, and what it might mean to the future. So it's almost impossible to stay in the present moment. We all know that, the feeling of flow that we experience when we're at our best. There is no past, there is no future, there is just the present moment. And the reason why that feels so good is because Sam's not there. Flow is the absence of the personal. It's the absence of any identification. So, you hear Tiger Woods say it, where he says, I've played some of the best shots in my life where I can't remember from the moment that I've taken the club out of the bag until the ball lands on the green. Well, that's because he's in flow. Tiger wasn't there in that moment. He was completely absorbed in what he was doing. And when you're absorbed, there is no you. Everything is one. You stop labeling aspects of your perception. You stop judging it, whether it's good or bad, and it's just unfolding as it's going to unfold.
Malcolm, you've probably got some sort of deeper end spectrums on what flow is. Perhaps if you could touch base on what it flow means to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually going to just loop back to connect to stuff that Sam said in terms of, in fact, the way I became conscious of this stuff was actually through my corporate world work. That in some 30 odd years ago, I was doing a lot of corporate finance work. And so companies, and lots of millionaires that I got to know through the golf, Sunningdale Wentworth individuals who were being asked to put £500,000 or £1 million into a company, and someone, could they go and have a look and tell me whether I should do it? I used to go in and look at all the financial numbers and try and look at the business. But in many cases where they were needing funding, actually they needed funding because they were going bust. And because they were going bust, they were in a state of fear. The results that were being created were causing much anguish. And once I started to look at what was causing it, you could see that the strategies that they were developing that were creating the results weren't terribly good. And I kept going, I've got a rabbit in the headlights here. What's causing that? And then as I started to get to look at the individuals who were running the companies, you realize that they were in a complete state of fear. The emotions had taken over everything that was in them. And so what that started to get me to realize was that whilst I was interested in the numbers, the results that we put on the scorecard, what drove it are the strategies. What drove the strategies was the environment, the culture that I was feeling. Am I feeling good? Am I feeling bad? But then who is that I? So I then got interested in the psychology of, well, who am I really? And so I ended up coming into the consciousness game through this similar piece of where the suffering was that started to beg the question, so who are these people? Who are they when they are operating? And when I stood in between them and then acted as a company troubleshooter between the banks and the creditors and the situation they had, once we calmed it down, suddenly everything started to make sense. So in a sense, it was almost like the higher self, the ego, the lower self, and the higher self. The higher self was sort of standing in between. What I was able to do was separate their ego from their fear of everything was going to fall apart to, actually, don't worry, just hold it. And in the space of a few weeks, we could slow them down, negotiate new facilities with the banks, and actually come up with a sensible strategy. And it was there that, and in fact, whilst I was doing that work, I came back as England golf captain and took over from Peter McAvoy back in '98, and playing with, or having in team, likes of Luke Donald and Justin Rose and Gary Wilson-Home and those guys. It was fascinating to then go, to what extent is ego getting in the way? And when you see some of these players play and actually they make a bogey, but they just walk onto the next tee, that bounce back ability aspect of people dropping shots. And I started realizing it's mirrored. That's what life is. So the idea, coming back to your question then of what is flow, what I started to realize was flow was when we were able to take this thing called ego, this thing that was fearful of the results, and allow it to operate, such as you don't realize what you do. It's almost natural. It's almost silence. In fact, that you're operating from a place of silence within yourself, that when you then switch the volume on and you go, oh, hello. Oh, well done. Good shot, Malcolm. Oh, where did that come from? So the subtlety, my route into this psychological stuff, well, what I'd ended up doing was I'd sort of stopped playing golf when I was sort of 20, 22, 23, so 82, 83, kept playing a bit of county golf, didn't really feel that I could get back. I was hooked on, well, I can't get back to where I was, so there's no point in playing. But then I realized that actually all of this was just psychology. And it was perfect. And what I'm loving, and especially this recently, is coming back, even during lockdown, just going out and playing 8 holes around the top of my golf club at Hembury and just enjoying the weather and chatting to someone, coming in and having a cup of coffee, detaching from the results. Has been lovely, and it's been a lovely experience. So I'm actually relearning to love my golf, which is exactly what Sam's saying. But what I've been doing most of my life has been helping organisations to re-love themselves, to realise that the reason the situations have got out of sync is simply the way they see the world. And that there are sort of vertical ways of seeing the world. Which floor do you see the world from? If you're in the Shard and looking at the world from the 50th floor, or from an airliner coming into Heathrow over London, that perspective of London's completely different than if I was in the underground car park. So what level of vertical consciousness do I see the world? And once we realised there are tools to analyse how you see the world, suddenly I started to realise in business terms, clear logical reasons why people adopted certain strategies, because their personalities were that way. So flow to me is getting into that higher self where you literally take you back out from the ego, and that's difficult. You have to learn to do it, and most times, it's just a spot. It's like glimpsing a reflection in the window as you walk past a shop. It just happens. You can't just go and grab it, but you can build to learn to let go of the things that are causing you to not do it, and move towards it rather than I can do it. Just go straight to it.
Okay, so Sam, how did you start the process of removing the I and letting go of the ego?
It's a process of stripping away. So what happens is, and this isn't about, as Malcolm put so eloquently there, this isn't a golf problem. It's not a business problem. This is the culture and the society that we exist in. And basically, from the moment we can communicate, we're basically taught to put conditions on our own happiness. So, to my mind, our natural state is happiness. If you speak to 99% of people and ask them when were you happiest, they'll say, well, when I was a child. And then what happens is we get gradually sucked into this misunderstanding and this conditioning where we're told that our happiness depends on outside circumstances. So, you'll be happy when you get this toy, or when this person is nice to you, or you make this person as a friend, or you get accepted into this school, you get these exam results, you get to this university, you get onto this golf team, when your handicap gets to scratch, when you get this kind of job, when you get this kind of car, when you win a tournament, when you get in the Ryder Cup team. And we spend our whole life making our happiness conditional on the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And it's pervasive, and that's the illusion, if you want to put it like that we're living in. And what I've come to see is that the only way is just to strip those beliefs away. And there's a slow way you can do it, or there's a fast way you can do it. So you can either do it one by one, like picking up leaves off your lawn, or you can just go in there and cut the bloody tree down. And that's basically what this exploration of the who am I question is, because once you see that who you really are is not a limited, finite entity, a body and a mind, basically all the other stuff, all the beliefs just disappear, because you stop identifying with something that needs the world to be a certain way in order for you to be okay. So that's the fast way. That's not for everybody. Some people are quite attached to their ego and quite attached to this idea of who they are, particularly if they've been successful in life. What you can do then is come at it from a slightly different angle, which is just gradually stripping away. It's like peeling an onion. You strip off the layers and you strip off the layers, and then at some point you get to a realization of, so that's what's going on. So, this is, there's different ways, and everybody will find their path, but all the paths lead to the same place, essentially.
Yeah, I think, so on that sort of story of when you're setting your goals and you're trying to reach, say, becoming member of this club, then you get a job promotion or you become a member of the Ryder Cup team, we all sort of identify those things as sort of who we are. I played for the Ryder Cup. I played on the European tour. I'm a member of Wentworth, Sunningdale. And then I think what you're trying to say is once I start just letting these things go, and actually I'm not any of those things.
Exactly.
Those things are just stories that I'm creating, that I'm trying to prove my identity, but actually that's not who we are. That's merely the attachments. And I think we'll touch on attachments in a minute with Malcolm. But I sort of, another story I had recently. So I recently me and my partner sort of split ways, and she's probably one of the most emotionally intelligent people I've ever met. And after we sort of went separate ways, I went down to my sister's son's birthday. He's 2 years old, and he's down in Devon, and he's playing on the beach, splashing himself in the sand and water, having a good old time. And he doesn't see me coming. And I walk onto the beach. And of course, just happens to be a beach I was with my girlfriend, a year ago. And it was a great day, had champagne on the beach, all of these great sort of stories, attachments and emotions that I'm experiencing, So I see Barnaby, his name is, and I'm in floods of tears. Yet when he turns round and sees me, he just sees me with just pure joy. And his face is just joy. And my face is just sadness and stories. So I'm lugging this basically, I'm Rudolph the reindeer lugging around a sleigh's worth of stories, which actually, if you think about it, I'm just on a beach, just me on a beach. I'm none of the stories. Those stories just got in the way of this amazing experience I could have had with my sister's son if I wasn't identifying with any of those stories.
Love that.
So I wanted to share that. And but Malcolm, so sort of attachments, because this is a process of removing the I and removing the ego. So what are the views on attachments?
Okay. Again, I'm going to just slide something in and then come and answer that, if I may. One of the bits, we talk about us being human beings. And we generally write it as human, and then the being we write as a small B-E-I-N-G. But ultimately what we are a human. We have a body, and that body has an operating system to allow it to run, which I'm going to call the lower self, the ego. And that allows our body to exist and us to function with each other. But ultimately, we're trying to develop our beingness, the spirit of who we really are, that essence of who we truly are, the universal essence, which is a capital B, capital E, capital I, capital N, capital G. Now, one way of looking at that which will then loop to the attachments, is to imagine we have an elastic band, and if you stuck one finger of one hand through one end of the elastic band and then other finger or the other, and you stretched, what we have is a stretch for an individual where we're trying to expand our beingness, the higher self, that true essence of who we are. But what often happens is the other finger holding the elastic band stays still. It's got its attachments to it, the ego attachments. Taking your story about the young lad that you saw on the beach, when we're young, we don't have those attachments. As we grow up, what happens is parents, school, culture, our mates all create these beliefs and these rules, which we take into our ego, which is this finger that is holding. So as we become more of a being and we stretch, what happens is a tension comes in the elastic band. And the issue then is, what do I do? Do I just stretch further with my beingness, or do I reduce it so as the tension disappears? Or do I hold the beingness and find a way of letting go of some of the ego attachments? Now, those ego attachments, they often say that in terms of creativity, children at sort of 3 and 4 are about sort of 97% creative. By the time they leave school, they've lost about 90% of their creativity because they've been institutionalized to fit society and the way that we expect you to operate. So what you see is that actually what we think growing up is, it's actually taking away and creating all these rules, the enslavement of our beingness that wants to go and be the greater being, but is being held down. And so the issue then is, so if I've got these attachments, how do I deal with them? Well, in terms of personally, I think the way Sam is approaching it for golf, I think is absolutely ideal, because one of the risks when we play golf is that we get stuck in the head. And often the teaching that we get is all about keeping on plane and actually making sure we got the grip. It's not that we don't need that, but the risk is that we stand over the ball thinking about too much. So actually learning to just let go is really, really important to allow yourself to see, actually, you have got, as the topic of our talk, an authentic swing, a swing that is really you, which is your higher self, your beingness that is really making that swing. For me, when I work with people, and I work with lots of executives around the world and people on their deeper meaning of life, so I get into the sort of spirit piece of people, could call it spiritual, but it's the sort of the deep meaning of who am I. Those attachments are generally seen around as dualities. I'm right, you're wrong. This is light, that is dark. If we look at the world at the moment with everything that's going on around it, everyone has a view. I'm right and you're wrong, and it's causing tensions. So one way that I work when I work with someone is I say, just tell me, if we're walking around, tell me what a few of your attentions are in life. And it could be a tension with your girlfriend, or a relationship. I've never quite got a relationship with my dad, or I just never thought I was good enough because, and actually for me, being honest, I took up golf. I ended up doing golf in order to prove I could be someone. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather are these sort of amazing individuals. And it's like, well, jeepers, I can't do it through the conventional legal system that they had developed their expertise. Actually, I'll do it through golf. So what I say is that what you have to do, you only have to think about what is it that's giving you some anguish. And when you get that anguish in you, that's the thing you need to work on. Now, what you've done is you've created a duality. You've created what you believe is reality and the belief, and they're looking at each other going, these don't correlate. There's something that's causing a problem here. Well, if there is a delta, a difference between the two, what do we need to do? Well, what I do is I help people to meditate. So it's about meditating and reflecting and going, what is it? Why is it that I'm looking at this situation thinking that's right? And then when I look at you and I think you haven't got it quite right, that's the tension that's being caused, the stretch of the elastic band. How would I have to be sitting in order for both of those to be right? Mm. And what I nearly always find is I get to sit in a different position, and suddenly you find it a non-dual unity position, where suddenly I go, if I was thinking this way, I'm right and Sam's right. and suddenly you can feel the tension release. So working with dualities is how I do it, but that's just in terms of I'm not applying it to golf, but I'm absolutely thrilled to see the way Sam's doing it in golf. But it's critical in order for us to then allow ourselves to keep pushing the flow of the beingness, which allows us to get closer to where our real swing is. Not the artificial swing that we've little bit of Watson, a little bit of Nicholas, a little bit of Faldo in the backswing, in the downswing, in the ego, because the ego loves to stay in control. It doesn't want to let go of control. So you give it something, it's got it. So, but actually what we have to do is find our authentic swing. And that authentic swing relates to you in your life just as much as it relates to you in your golf.
We'll touch on the authentic swing in a bit more detail in a bit, but the sort of, you said that anguish is, that creates the sort of, attachment, but it could be also like the need, for example, because like say during like lockdown, in this instance, the need for most golfers is, or the attachment is, I need to go and play golf today. That was who I am, and I'm missing out on this big part of my life. So I'd say also, like, once you sort of experience those sort of needs in life, I need to have a glass of wine tonight. I need to have some chocolate after my meal. I need to have coffee. Those are, I think, really good cues as attachments for you to sort of look at deeply and then sort of reflect upon them. And that's where the work can be done. I think those are good triggers or highlights. Does that make sense? That
makes absolute sense, because the ego is attached to materialism. So it's the density of matter. So your addictions can be, I'm addicted to alcohol, not necessarily addicted to the extent I need to go to AAs, but it's like I need to have a drink, and I want to have a nice car, and I want to have a big house, and I want to be in control of my life. Money, power, sex, materialism are all things that we get attached to. If I had a magic wand and I could go bang, if we all got rid of our attachments, I didn't need a big house and a big car and a big, and lots of money, you would suddenly have a sustainable planet. This planet, we would have chaos in the economic system because it would have to completely rejig it. But that's almost what we're saying with the golf swing. We need to rejig. It's all about the technical swing. Yes, that's part of it. But actually, it's all about being authentic in your own swing. So you're right. You can work at looking at all those things that you feel. And our economic system, our social system, actually says if you haven't got a big house and a big car and a nice looking clothes and a lovely girlfriend on your arm or whatever, whoever, actually you're not successful. So because it wants to perpetuate you being stuck in materiality. Once you start letting go, just things start flowing. So this sort of freeway conversation came about maybe through Sam, as he's sort of doing some work in and around the movie Legend Bag Advance. So I was wondering if we could just touch base on that with you, Sam, and what the Legend Bag Advance film, and more importantly, the book, means to you in and around this space.
Yeah. So I saw the film about 20 years ago. I think the original book was written in 1995 by a guy called Stephen Pressfield, who's a really great author, quite an unusual author in that he writes both fiction and non-fiction. So he's written some quite famous sort of non-fiction books, The War of Art and Turning Pro, are two of his probably best known books. But he's also he writes historical novels as well. So he's written about the Greeks. He's written a book about Rommel. He's written a book about Afghanistan, and he wrote this historical golf novel about a match played in the early 1930s between Bobby Jones and Walter Hagen and this reluctant sort of local golfer hero. And the film was all right. It's well written, it's well directed, it's got Matt Damon in it, Will Smith, Charlize Theron. It's fine. But I sort of dismissed it because I just thought, well, it's all right. So I kind of didn't look the book up. Anyway, I was reading. I'm writing my next book at the moment, or have been for the last year, and I kind of dug out The War of Art because it is essentially a book about creativity and a book about writing. And I was kind of working through it, and I was like, wow, this book is really different from how I remember it, particularly the last section, where he talks about the higher self, where creativity comes from. And I was like, wow, he's talking about consciousness. He's talking about awareness. He's talking about, what I'm talking to golfers about. And then I got to the back of the book and I saw, they always list his bibliography. And I was like, oh my goodness, he wrote The Legend of Bagger Vance. And I was like, I knew straight away that The Legend of Bagger Vance was going to be an amazing book if it was about what he was pointing to in the last bit of War of Art. And sure enough, I get 3 pages in and I'm just like, Sam, you're an idiot. You've kind of dismissed this for the last 20 years on the back of not liking the film. So anyway, I've spent the last probably 3 months just immersing myself in, as I say, in Steve Pressfield's book. It's the best book about the mental side of the game of golf that I've ever read, and I've read a lot of them. It's a great story, and yeah, I think it's wonderful. It's I've written extensively about it. It started off like I'd normally do, just writing some notes on it, and that's now become a volume. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it. It's a project at the moment, whether it's going to be a book or some sort of, some other way of sharing what I think about it. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's fantastic. I'd absolutely recommend anybody that's curious about themselves and curious about the game of golf to get a copy. There's a nice audiobook version out there as well, which if people aren't big readers, you can get the audiobook as well. So yeah, highly recommended. So
what is the main premise of the book for those perhaps who haven't either watched the film or haven't read the book, in particular about the relationship between the player and his caddy, and what we've talked about? It's a very leading question.
There's about 4 questions in there, mate. So there's a couple of different threads working through the book. So the book is ostensibly about this reluctant golfer who's been basically pressed to play in this huge match with Hagen and Jones, and he's got this caddy, which is Will Smith's character in the film. So Matt Damon is Juna, and then Will Smith is the caddy. And the book itself, the novel, is based on the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the foundational texts of the Hindu faith, Hindu religion. And it's the big relationship in the Bhagavad Gita is Arjuna, who is a warrior, and his charioteer, Krishna. And so basically what Pressfield's done is take that relationship and make it into a story about golf, of a golfer and his caddy. And what you actually see is, as you read the book, without giving too much away, but it appears that the conversations in the book are a dialogue between a golfer and his caddy. Actually, it's a monologue. It's between you and yourself, or you and your higher self, or the golfer and his higher self. And I think Malcolm will probably, he knows the Gita a little bit better than I do. I've read it a couple of times, but he's been studying it. So, yeah, so there's that aspect to it, which is fascinating, because every golfer knows that the real challenge, the real battle, if you want to put it like that, is not between you and your opponent or you and the course. It's between you and yourself. Every golfer has got a conversation going on in their mind, or sometimes not in their mind. Sometimes it's out loud of, oh, why did you do that? You stupid so-and-so. Why did you hit it over there? Well, who's talking? Who's that conversation between? And this is basically the essence of the book, is exploring that conversation and asking those 3 questions that I mentioned earlier. Who am I? What's the nature of reality? And what's the meaning of life? So as a way into that conversation for a golfer, most of the sort of golf psychology books or golf mental books are very much sort of how-to manuals, what to think and how to think it, how to control your emotions, how to control your feelings. This is completely different. For a start, it's a novel. So it kind of bypasses the intellect. So you can read it as a story, and it's almost like the learning sneaks in under the intellect. So you're not constantly filtering it and going, oh, well, do I agree with that or do I not agree with that? You know, does that make sense or does that not make sense? It just kind of goes in and you're just sort of immersed in it. But, you know, the other big sort of idea in the book is this idea of the authentic swing. So as I say, it's working on lots of different levels. At the more sort of literal end of things is this idea that we've all got a swing that's our own swing that we were born with. It's kind of like part of our DNA. It's in us, and our job is to uncover that, to find it, not to, you know, not that our swing is not something external that we get from somewhere else, whether it's from golf magazines or from teachers or from books or wherever we think this stuff comes from. It's in us already, and you know, he uses the analogy of the statue of David. So how did Michelangelo produce David? Well, he just chipped everything away that wasn't David. So he had a marble block, chipped everything away that wasn't David, and what are you left with? Well, that's kind of the idea with this, is that, again, similar to what we said earlier about stripping away to find out who we really are, when we strip away everything that we think we know about golf, what are we left with?
I'll read a quick quote out from that film, from Bag of Vance, which is Will Smith in the movie, and he says, "Yep, inside each and every one of us is a true, authentic swing, something we were born with, something that is ours and ours alone, something that can't be taught or learned, something that's got to be remembered. Over the time world can by, rob us of that swing. It gets buried inside us under all our wouldas, couldas, and shouldas."
I love that. I love that. Oh, it's really interesting. It's like, you know, it seems like, you know, there's these things called coincidences, but I'm not sure whether those things exist. But I saw a lovely little clip on Twitter this morning of Bob Torrance, the sort of Sam Torrance's father, famous golf coach, and it was just a 30-second clip, but in it he was saying, you know, he was asked about his philosophy for learning golf and for teaching golf. And he says, you can't teach a method. You have to teach the person that you've got in front of you. You have to teach the individual. And that to me kind of sums this up, because we're not saying, you know, you can't just take your idea of the golf swing and then patch it on to other people. What Bob's saying there is you have to uncover what's in that person already. That's your job as a coach. And I know, you know, from my own perspective, it's something that I've sort of, you know, when I first started coaching, I certainly had my own ideas about the golf swing that, unfortunately, and I apologise to the people that I, you know, was giving lessons to way back then, but yeah, you know, I was sort of far too keen to impose my ideas of what a golf swing should be and what it should look like onto other people. Whereas, you know, now I see it as completely the opposite. It's about helping people strip away their ideas of what a golf swing should be to allow their authentic swing to emerge.
There are obviously basic principles and laws and fundamentals of how the golf swing should operate under. But I suppose, like, you know, when the classic one is like when a pro pulls up your video of your swing and then puts it alongside Tiger Woods and tells you, you know, you need to be more like Tiger rather than more like yourself. Or, you know, as we step out on the golf course and, you know, we watch the Masters on Sunday and we like certain positions of Brooks Koepka's swing or Bryson's setup or Steve Stricker's putting, you know, angle with his shaft lean, and we start taking all these bits from other players and then try and mash them together to formulate our own game. But actually it comes back to this process perhaps of, you know, peeling off and finding what our authentic swing is. Malcolm, you've got some sort of insights on the Gita, if we could touch on that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the Gita is a special text. I mean, in Christianity, the Bible would be the equivalent, and Krishna would be Jesus, because Krishna was an incarnation of Vishnu, which is the Christ, and Jesus was an incarnation of the Christ. So they are similar. One of the bits I would just pick up is one of the coaching techniques is about being your own caddy. Sometimes when you rewind, it's like, go on, imagine, what would you be saying? Would you be talking to yourself the way you're talking, as a caddy? And the caddy's saying, come on, Mal, you're okay. Don't worry, we can get that one back. Don't worry. So the idea of that as a method is actually just realizing that you're trying to just be your higher self. It's you talking to yourself. And one of the issues that I have seen and feel is that even when we take the word psychology, in Greek, psyche means soul. But what's happened is that psychology has tried to make it a science, which has got it trapped in the ego aspect of the lower self, rather than realizing that psyche is about that and the higher self. And out of Hinduism, which is where the Bhagavad Gita Bhagavad Gita was in Hinduism, Buddhism spun out from that. And one of the aspects of Buddhism is about taking out the self, because it says there is no self. We have a lower self, but doesn't recognize a higher self. In Hinduism, there's a higher self and a lower self. Now, one of the bits that sometimes gets misinterpreted is that in taking out the ego, in taking out the attachments, you don't need the ego. Actually, what you need is the ego to be aligned to and in service to, sublimated to the higher self. So the ego has to turn in service to the higher self and to operate. So this idea of, are we saying you don't need to think about swing techniques? No, I'm not saying that at all. What we are saying is you do need to be aligned to your authentic higher self, your own caddy, your own bag of ants, which is in you. And then as you bring that authentic swing that is you, then which techniques might help to support that authentic swing? As Sam, I know, says, if you see whether it be Seve or Faldo or Sandy Lyle at a distance, you know exactly who you're watching. You can see the swing. It is their swing. But when it comes to what method, would you be getting Bernard Langer's methodology and applying it to Seve? Not necessarily. There may be certain instances that odd tips would help. But what we're doing is we're saying that the technical is not irrelevant. It's absolutely relevant, but only after it is in service to the natural, the inner you, the true self coming through. And that is an important piece, because there's a risk that people say that what we're saying is actually just go to the higher level, just swing, don't worry about technique at all. Anyway, you can hold the club any old way. We know, you and I know, well, we've got in Gloucester a gentleman who plays cack-handed, and it's amazing when you sit. You don't have to play conventionally, but it bringing the lower self in service to the higher self.
Sam, thoughts?
Yeah, this isn't about, as Malcolm said, it's not about dismissing technique, and there are certain things that in a golf swing will make it easier for you, and certain things that will make it much more difficult. There are physical laws, so but what I've sort of come to see is that if you can help a player to understand those physical laws, and when we're talking about golf, we're basically talking about the ball flight laws. So if you can get somebody to understand what makes a golf ball do what it does, really understand it. So swing path, club face, angle of attack, spin loft, all of those things. If you can help a player to understand those, they will come up with their own best way of then creating the launch conditions that they're looking for. And I found that to be a much more enjoyable, and two, much more sympathetic way of learning the golf swing, because you're not trying to be someone you're not. Just like we live in a world where there are certain physical laws, and the better you understand those physical laws, the nicer time you have. If you don't understand gravity very well, for example, you're going to get yourself into a bit of a pickle. So the ball flight laws just fall into those. The more you can understand your environment and you can understand the physical laws by which whatever you're trying to do is governed, so the task, then you can go off and find your own best way of doing that. And we can see that throughout golf. There are so many different ways of swinging the golf club that work. Even if you look at golfers who are coached by the same coach, their swings will look different because players are taller, they're shorter, they're built differently, they've got different physical characteristics. So there might be similarities, but every one of those golfers will have their own way of doing it. And as I say, I remember one of my sort of first coaches said to me, the object is not to learn the golf swing, it's to learn your golf swing. And that ties exactly back into what we're saying here and what the Legend of Bag of Ants is about, which is about uncovering your authentic swing. It's about finding out who you are.
Malcolm, you sort of mentioned in a sort of chat prior to this quote, when the measure becomes a target, it is no longer a measure. I was wondering if we could just expand on that based on what Sam's talked about.
Yeah. Well, we've got an inner life, a life where our higher self operates. Our ego's in there, but our ego is very attached to the material life, which has an external aspect to it. So when we're talking about measures and targets, one of the issues, if we're trying to operate from our higher self, which is inside ourselves, then what we're trying to do is observe and not get too emotionally attached. Now, the quote that I've used is one that we use in business, but actually is very relevant for sport, which is that as soon as we are looking at, how are we doing with this particular measure, if you just observe it, yeah, that was good, yeah, that was okay, bit far, bit to the right, bit to the left. We're just making intuitive adjustments. Our mind is completing the picture to what we need to do to adjust. It's a bit like when you stand on the tee and you say, don't hit it on the lake to someone. What are they going to do? Chances are the mind's going to complete the picture and send the ball into the lake. What we really want to do is, where do we want it to go? Well, let's look at where we would like this ball to go. And actually, I've just hit a number of putts and it's gone, 6 inches, a foot left. Maybe I've just got to aim a bit further right. I'm just observing. It's just a measure. It was a foot left. Just observe it. When I was expecting to hole, 10 out of 10 from 6 feet, and I've got to 8 and I'm building the pressure. I'm setting a target of having to hold that putt. What is doing is I'm creating a judgment, which the ego will love to lock onto, will hopefully get to go, yeah, I've got, and if I get 9 out of 10 and I miss the 10th, right, I'm still here. I've got another hour. I'm going to keep going until I get this. What you're doing is you're creating a target. But what it does is it also creates an attachment. Rather than an observation. Okay, I missed one. All right. So what was it? What was it that I did? Just observe it. So this idea of measures and targets, we are very driven. A lot of the techniques of trying to improve people is to say, okay, these are the key measures that we think will determine whether you are playing good golf. The key is simply to observe them as measures and go, oh, yeah, I didn't hit as many greens or as many fairways today. What do I need to do, rather than get as soon as the emotion comes up, go, that was rubbish. How did I do it? I'm going to hit balls until my hands bleed to get this right. That's when we've suddenly brought the ego back in. All the attachments are there because we turned something that was simply a measure into an emotional target. And that is where care is needed. It's not about not having targets, but we need to look at them simply as measures. Just okay. And it's a subtlety, but it's the way of trying to keep the ego out of it. As soon as you put too many targets, the ego will be attacked, and all these attachments are there, and you're being pulled into the lower self rather than flowing from your higher self.
So I think we can always do like a round 2 on this if the viewers like it. So coming back to that sort of main theme of the talk, Sam, discovering your authentic swing for golf, for life. Is there any sort of like final roundups you want to sort of talk about or bring up with the remaining time?
I think it's, you touched on it earlier. It's just about asking different questions. And unfortunately, the culture and the society that we live in, and this is a wider society, but it's also what Fred Shoemaker, very aptly named the culture of golfers in his book Extraordinary Golf. It's another great golf book if you're looking for something to read. He comes up with this idea of the culture of golfers, and golf has its own culture. And the problem with the culture is if we're not careful, we get caught up in it and we ask the same questions and we get tied into the same beliefs and the same misunderstandings that everybody else is tied into. And, it's really interesting when we, for example, when we see what Bryson DeChambeau's done over the last sort of few months. It's not everybody's cup of tea. Not everybody agrees with the way he's approached it. But what he's done is basically come at golf from a completely different angle and go, right, how can I ask different questions? How can the game be played differently in order for me to get an advantage based on the equipment that's now available to us? And he's come up with essentially a new method of playing golf. Now, do I enjoy watching it? No. Do I think that it is good for the game? No, but that's just my judgment, and who am I to make that call? So I just think that when you're uncovering any of these things, whether we're talking about how to hit a particular shot, or what the best way of swinging the golf club is, or even going deeper than that, and as I say, asking these three big questions: who am I? What's the nature of my experience? What's the meaning of life? Most people don't ask those questions very often. And just by asking those and looking at life and at golf in a slightly different way, I think a lot of golfers and a lot of people in general will find out some pretty interesting things about themselves and about the life that they think they should be living.
Malcolm.
Okay, I'm going to throw an interesting one. I'm going to throw the word surrender, because I think part of what this is about us learning to surrender to our higher self. One of the issues is ego doesn't do surrender. Surrender's giving in, and therefore our world is all about, I've got to win, I've got to do better. That's an ego attachment. And we're not saying that you won't do well by being, but it's a challenge about being rather than becoming. So this whole piece of surrendering, in using the word surrender, you have to explain it, but it is about surrendering to that caddy, that higher self, that beingness of who you are, and then from that place allow the swing to flow so that it then flows down. And the becoming is the physical ego hitting the ball, but the being is that inner space. But in order to get there, you need to surrender, and therefore watch when you're out there and you're practicing, to what extent are you really connecting to who you are, surrendering into who you really are. It's the only way you can get to your beingness is to surrender. You can't make yourself get to there. That will be the ego just sneakily staying in control. Surrender to it, and you will find you will get much better results, would be my advice.
Sam, any last final words?
No, mate. I think Malcolm's hit the nail on the head there. It's go on. You've enticed me into it. Just that idea of giving up. It's not. Again, when we say surrender, that's not a doing. It's just allowing something to happen, and I get this a lot where people say, what, am I not supposed to care about the game anymore? And it's like, well, no, that's not what we're saying. It's about understanding who cares. And that's what Malcolm's saying. Like if you're driven by the ego caring, and the ego is all about what other people think of you and status and material stuff, that's going to feel very different from where, something that really cares about the game, because that love for the game is unconditional. It's coming from as Malcolm says, a higher place rather than a lower place. So no, you can absolutely care about the game and love the game. Just don't be attached to it. Don't be attached to the outcome.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I think we'll call it round one there with Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali. And we will, I'll tell you what, if the viewers liked this episode, they can email me at makingaclubchampion@gmail.com, or you can get hold of Malcolm and Sam. I'll make sure both of their websites and details are on the webpage. And perhaps we could do another freeway, or if people, we can go deeper into these subjects or even lighter. So I thought that was a very fantastic and sort of philosophical conversation. I think we could carry on for a couple more hours, but I think this is a good intro into this, which is very different from the previous episodes. So I say let's leave it there and see what happens going forward.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks, gents. Thanks, guys. Enjoyed it.
Well done.
No worries. Cheers, guys.
Thank you.
Take care.
Cheers. Bye.